Today is May 13th, 2026, and the announcement that Vladimir Putin made this week was designed to land at a specific moment in a specific news environment, directed at a specific set of audiences who would each receive it differently and all arrive at the same conclusion. Russia has successfully tested the RS-28 Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile and has announced plans to place it on active combat duty before the end of 2026. The Sarmat, the weapon the Russian military calls Satan II, the weapon Putin unveiled in 2018 alongside 5 other strategic systems as the foundational architecture of Russia's 21st century nuclear deterrence posture, the weapon that has experienced development setbacks significant enough that a September 2024 test reportedly left a deep crater at the launch silo rather than producing the clean demonstration its designers intended. That weapon has now been successfully tested, and Putin went on national television to announce it with the specific language of a man who calculated every word before speaking it. The yield of the warhead is more than 4 times greater than any Western equivalent. Its range exceeds 21,000 miles, making it capable of reaching any target in the United States from any launch position inside Russian territory. It can penetrate all existing and future anti-missile defense systems, and it will be on combat duty before the year is out. Read that announcement against the backdrop of everything else happening in the world on May 13th, 2026. The Trump Sea summit in Beijing scheduled for the coming days, where Iran's nuclear file and the Hormuz blockade are the central agenda items. The ceasefire between the United States and Iran described by Trump as being on life support. The IRGC commando infiltration of a Kuwaiti island during active peace negotiations. The Russian naval destroyer Severomorsk positioned between Fehmarn and Lubeck Bay in the Baltic Sea, prompting a rapid NATO naval response that is currently active. Putin did not test the Sarmat this week because the weapon happened to be ready. He announced it this week because the strategic moment demanded a communication that only a successful ICBM test can deliver. The question is what that communication was, who it was directed at, and what it means for every other situation running simultaneously in a world where the most consequential diplomatic conversation of the decade is happening in Beijing, while a Russian destroyer sits in the Baltic and Iran's Mosquito fleet assembles in coastal caves north of the Strait of Hormuz. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand why the Sarmat's announced deployment this week is not primarily a story about a weapon system, but is primarily a story about strategic signaling delivered through a weapon system at a moment of maximum geopolitical leverage. You need to understand what the Sarmat actually is, what it can and cannot do, what the 2018 announcement it is part of was designed to achieve, and why the specific timing of this week's test announcement tells you more about Russia's strategic calculation than the weapon specifications do. Here's where things stand as of May 13th, 2026. Russia has announced successful testing of the RS-28 Sarmat ICBM and declared plans for operational deployment by year's end. A Russian naval destroyer is currently positioned in a sensitive maritime corridor near northern Germany in the Baltic Sea, with NATO's Standing Naval Force 1 responding with German and French frigates in what regional defense sources are characterizing as a genuine escalation risk rather than routine naval activity. Putin is scheduled to meet Trump in Beijing for the first U.S. presidential visit to China in a decade, a summit where Iran's nuclear file, the Hormuz blockade, and the global economic consequences of the strait's closure are the dominant agenda items that neither side can avoid regardless of every other bilateral issue they would prefer to discuss. The ceasefire between the United States and Iran is on life support. The IRGC sent commandos onto a Kuwaiti military island last night during active peace negotiations. The Chinese economy is absorbing the supply disruption consequences of a Hormuz blockade that is simultaneously destroying Iran's oil revenues, trapping 73 Iranian tankers carrying $13 billion in cargo, and adding $500 million per day to Tehran's accumulated economic losses. Everything is happening simultaneously. And into that specific environment, Putin chose this specific week to announce the Sarmat's successful test and deployment timeline. Understanding that choice is understanding the current state of Russian strategic thinking more accurately than any diplomatic statement Moscow has issued since the Hormuz crisis began. Now let's get into what the Sarmat actually is, because the weapon specifications carry strategic weight that cannot be assessed without understanding them precisely. The RS-28 Sarmat, designated SSX-30 Satan II in NATO nomenclature, is a 3-stage, silo-based, liquid-fueled, super-heavy intercontinental ballistic missile produced by the Makeyev Rocket Design Bureau. It was designed specifically to replace the Soviet-era R-36 MEM missile, known in the West as Satan I, which had been the backbone of Russia's heavy ICBM fleet for decades, and which was approaching the end of its operational life expectancy. The Sarmat is a different category of weapon from its predecessor, not in concept, but in capability parameters. It is capable of carrying a payload of approximately 10 tons in multiple configurations. The primary warhead loading option involves 10 individually targeted 750 kiloton warheads delivered through a multiple independent reentry vehicle system, the MIRV architecture, that allows a single missile to attack multiple geographically separated targets simultaneously, with each warhead maneuvering independently toward its programmed aim point after separation from the delivery bus. Alternative configurations include 15 to 16 lighter warheads with different yield profiles, or a combination of nuclear warheads and hypersonic glide vehicles that operate on a different trajectory and terminal approach profile than conventional ballistic reentry vehicles. The range that Putin cited, exceeding 21,000 miles, is not a demonstration of how far the missile needs to travel to reach its targets. It is a demonstration that the missile can travel any route to reach any target, including trajectories that approach American territory from directions that existing ground-based missile defense radars are not optimally positioned to provide early warning coverage for. The Fractional Orbital Bombardment System capability, FOBS, allows the missile to place its payload into a low orbital trajectory before deorbiting toward the target, enabling approach geometries that circumvent the defensive radar coverage patterns that American missile defense architecture was designed around. Read what the MIRV capability specifically means for missile defense, because this is the technical detail that makes the Sarmat a qualitatively different challenge from simpler ICBM designs. A MIRV-equipped missile releases multiple independently targeted warheads in the terminal phase of flight. Each warhead is a separate, ballistically distinct object that ground-based interceptors must acquire, track, and engage individually. A single Sarmat carrying 10 MIRVed warheads requires 10 successful intercept attempts by a missile defense system operating under the time constraints of a ballistic re-entry sequence. American ground-based missile defense interceptors, the GBI system deployed at Fort Greely, Alaska, and Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, were designed and tested against single warhead ICBM threats in relatively controlled test scenarios. Their tested success rate against even simplified single warhead targets has been less than consistently impressive in the documented public test record. Against 10 simultaneously arriving independently maneuvering warheads from a single Sarmat launch, the intercept probability calculation does not scale linearly from the single warhead baseline. It encounters the fundamental limitation of having to put more interceptors into flight than the available magazine depth of deployed interceptors allows. Putin's claim that the Sarmat can penetrate all existing and future anti-missile defense systems is not purely rhetorical. It reflects the genuine technical assessment of any honest missile defense engineer who looks at what 10 MIRVed warheads approaching from a FOBS trajectory require a defending system to accomplish within the available engagement timeline. The honest counterweight to Putin's specifications is what Western security analysts have consistently pointed out about Russian claims for this weapons program, and it requires saying clearly because the gap between claimed capability and demonstrated capability matters for accurately assessing what the Sarmat's successful test actually confirms. Putin has a documented history of making exaggerated capability claims for new Russian strategic weapons. The 2018 announcement that introduced the Sarmat alongside 5 other strategic systems was accompanied by animated graphics showing nuclear warheads raining down on Florida in what was widely interpreted as a direct message to American observers about the consequences of missile defense expansion. The graphics were impressive. The timeline the announcement implied for operational deployment was not met. Russia initially intended the Sarmat to be operational by 2022. The weapon encountered development problems significant enough that the 2024 test reportedly damaged the launch silo rather than proceeding cleanly. The successful test being announced this week is the first clean test demonstration that Russia has been able to confirm publicly, which means the Sarmat's development program has been running approximately 4 years behind its original schedule and has overcome development challenges significant enough to produce a silo-damaging test failure. That history of development difficulty does not invalidate the weapon's capability once it is confirmed operational. It does mean that the gap between Putin's announcement of what the Sarmat can do and what independent technical assessment can verify, it has demonstrated doing, is a gap that honest analysis requires acknowledging. The weapon is real. The development has been difficult. The successful test is genuinely significant. The claims attached to it deserve the same skepticism that Western analysts have consistently applied to Russian strategic weapons program announcements, while also taking seriously the underlying capability the weapon represents once it is actually deployed. Now let's talk about the other 2 weapons Putin announced in 2018 alongside the Sarmat, because understanding what Russia has been building across the full spectrum of its strategic modernization program is the context that makes the Sarmat's announced deployment meaningful rather than isolated. The Poseidon, also known by its Russian program designation Status Sisksa, is an autonomous, nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed unmanned underwater vehicle. It is not a torpedo in the conventional sense of a weapon fired from a submarine at a nearby naval target. It is a self-propelled nuclear device capable of operating at oceanic depths and at intercontinental ranges under its own nuclear propulsion, designed to approach coastal targets without the vulnerabilities that surface or aerial delivery systems face from missile defense and air defense architectures. Russian claims for the Poseidon's capability include the ability to create radioactive tsunamis by detonating in shallow coastal water near populated coastlines, combining the destructive effect of a nuclear detonation with the mechanical energy of a tsunami wave to produce a compounded effect that no defensive system currently deployed can intercept. The Poseidon is real. Images and video of testing have been confirmed by multiple intelligence communities. Its claimed operational capability, particularly the tsunami effect claims, remain in the category of asserted rather than demonstrated capability, and Western naval analysts have raised significant questions about whether the claimed effects are achievable at the scales Russia describes. But the underlying concept, an autonomous nuclear weapon that operates below the depth profile of current anti-submarine warfare systems and approaches coastal targets via routes that missile defense architecture cannot address, represents a genuine category of strategic weapon for which no Western defensive system is specifically designed. The Burevestnik, known in NATO designation as SSCX-9 Skyfall, is the third of the three weapons in Russia's announced 2018 strategic modernization program that carries the potential to fundamentally alter strategic deterrence calculations. It is a low-flying, nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed cruise missile whose defining claimed characteristic is unlimited range. The claim of unlimited range rests on the nuclear propulsion system, which theoretically provides the energy required to sustain flight indefinitely without the fuel exhaustion that limits conventionally powered cruise missiles. Russia has conducted Burevestnik test flights and has publicly stated the weapon achieved ranges of 14,000 miles in one confirmed test. The development program has experienced significant difficulties, including a 2019 incident at a Russian test facility at Nyonoksa that killed 5 Russian nuclear scientists and produced a brief radioactive atmospheric release detected by Norwegian monitoring stations. The incident confirmed that Russia's nuclear cruise missile program is real and has genuine operational development activity behind it, while simultaneously demonstrating that the technical challenges of nuclear-powered sustained flight are significant enough to produce accidents with lethal consequences during the development phase. None of the three weapons, the Sarmat, the Poseidon, and the Burevestnik, represents a departure from the fundamental logic of nuclear deterrence. They represent Russia's response to the American missile defense expansion that began in the early 2000s, which Russian strategic planners assessed as an existential threat to the credibility of Russia's nuclear deterrent if it continued without a Russian counter. The weapons are not first-strike weapons designed to enable Russia to attack without retaliation. They are second-strike weapons designed to ensure Russia can retaliate after absorbing a first strike, maintaining the mutually assured destruction logic that has prevented nuclear war between great powers since 1945. Now, let's get into why the Baltic Sea deployment of the Russian naval destroyer this week is the dimension of the current Russian strategic posture that carries the most immediate escalation risk. Because the Sarmat announcement operates on a strategic time frame while the Baltic deployment is generating real-time operational responses from NATO assets that are already in the water. The Severomorsk, the Russian destroyer confirmed to be positioned between Fehmarn and Lübeck Bay near the northern German coast, is not conducting a routine transit of international waters. It has been anchored in what regional defense sources describe as a sensitive maritime corridor, a position that places it in a geographic relationship with critical German and broader European undersea infrastructure, including communication cables and energy pipelines that NATO's maritime intelligence community has been monitoring with elevated concern since the undersea infrastructure sabotage incidents of 2022. A Russian surface combatant at anchor in a fixed position in a sensitive maritime corridor is not a navigational presence. It is a statement. NATO's response, the deployment of elements of Standing Naval Force 1, including German and French frigates to the area, is the immediate operational answer to that statement, placing Allied surface combatants in visual and sensor contact with the Russian vessel to ensure that any action the Russian destroyer takes against undersea infrastructure or in the maritime environment more broadly occurs with NATO assets directly present. The combination of the Sarmat announcement and the Baltic deployment in the same week is the specific signal structure that experienced strategic analysts recognize as deliberate rather than coincidental. The strategic nuclear announcement establishes the upper bound of Russian capability and communicates the consequences of any response that crosses Russian-defined thresholds. The Baltic deployment establishes the immediate operational presence that creates the specific situation requiring an immediate response. Together, they are the full spectrum of a deliberate signaling campaign compressed into a single week, chosen with specific attention to what else is happening in the international environment at the same moment. Read what that simultaneous signaling means in the context of the Trump Sea summit that is about to begin in Beijing. Putin knows that the Hormuz crisis is the dominant topic that Trump and Xi will discuss. Putin knows that China is being positioned as the potential back channel that could pressure Iran toward a nuclear deal that resolves the blockade. Putin knows that a successful Trump-Xi summit outcome on Iran would represent the kind of American-Chinese diplomatic alignment that reduces Russian influence in the Middle East crisis management process. A successful Sarmat test announcement delivered in the week of the Trump-Xi summit is a Russian communication to both Washington and Beijing simultaneously. To Washington, it says, "Whatever you discuss in Beijing, you are doing it knowing that Russia's strategic nuclear posture has just been upgraded with a system you cannot intercept." To Beijing, it says, "The world's strategic military architecture includes Russia as a permanent and now freshly demonstrated nuclear power whose interests in the Hormuz crisis outcome are not subordinate to whatever America-China bilateral agreement the summit might produce." And to Iran, it says its most significant remaining external patron has just confirmed that it retains the kind of strategic nuclear power that makes Western military adventurism in the broader Eurasian strategic environment operate with constraints that the specific situation in the Persian Gulf does not fully capture. Putin is not defending Iran with a Sarmat announcement. He is reminding every relevant actor that Russia's strategic weight exists in every calculation, including calculations being made in a conference room in Beijing about what kind of pressure to apply to a regime that is running out of oil revenue and water simultaneously. Now let's talk about what the Sarmat announcement means for the Iran conflict specifically, because the connection between a Russian ICBM test and a naval blockade in the Persian Gulf is not immediately obvious and requires working through the strategic logic that connects them. Putin privately pressured the Islamic Republic to negotiate with the United States, confirmed by multiple diplomatic sources in the period before the Trump-Xi summit. That private pressure represented Russia's calculation that the cost of being seen as the primary defender of the regime that killed tens of thousands of its own citizens in January 2026 exceeded the strategic benefit of maintaining Allied solidarity with Tehran. But private pressure to negotiate is a different posture from abandoning the deterrence architecture that prevents American military escalation from expanding beyond the current Hormuz theater into a broader confrontation with Russian strategic interests. The Sarmat announcement performs the function of maintaining that deterrence architecture, while the private diplomacy performs the function of managing the specific Iran situation toward a resolution that prevents the collapse of a regional state Russia does not want to see replaced with chaos. These are not contradictory positions. They are complementary positions, operate at different levels of the escalation ladder simultaneously. Russia is telling Tehran to make a deal, and Russia is simultaneously telling Washington that the strategic environment within which any military escalation beyond the current theater would occur now includes a freshly tested ICBM on a deployment timeline that ends before December 31st, 2026. The operational timeline of the Sarmat's deployment commitment is itself a signal that deserves specific attention. Putin announced that the Sarmat will be on combat duty by the end of 2026, not in 2027, not in the next defense planning cycle, by the end of 2026. That timeline means the Sarmat's deployment countdown is running simultaneously with every other crisis timeline that is currently active. The CIA's 3 to 4 month Iranian endurance window, the Trump Sea summit's outcome, the Karg Island storage crisis's days remaining counter, the ceasefire's life support status. All of these operational clocks are ticking in the same calendar year that Putin is now committed to as the Sarmat's deployment deadline. The compression of the strategic nuclear deployment timeline into the same year as the acute regional crises is not accidental. It is a deadline management communication that tells every strategic planner watching the current situation that the decisions being made in the Hormuz theater in 2026 are being made within the context of a Russian strategic posture that will be qualitatively different by the time the year ends. Make your decisions about how far to push, how much to escalate, how completely to commit to the military options being reviewed in the National Security Council meetings that Trump has been holding twice a week, within the knowledge of what the strategic environment looks like when 2026 ends and the Sarmat is operational. Now, let's get into the three-track convergence that makes the Sarmat announcement more than a technology story, and instead, the third leg of a strategic pressure architecture that Russia is operating in parallel with the Iran crisis and the Baltic deployment simultaneously. The nuclear track is the Sarmat itself, a successfully tested super heavy ICBM with MIRV capability, FOBS capability, and a deployment timeline that ends before December 2026. The message delivered by this track is the deterrence message. Any military escalation that expands beyond the current Iran theater into a direct US-Russia confrontation occurs in a strategic nuclear environment where Russia's counterforce capability is about to receive its most significant qualitative upgrade in decades. That message does not require Russia to threaten nuclear war. It requires only the demonstration that Russia's nuclear posture continues to be modernized on a timeline that makes the escalation ladder's upper rungs a real, rather than theoretical consideration for every actor contemplating where the current crisis might lead. The conventional pressure track is the Baltic deployment. The Severomorsk at anchor near German undersea infrastructure is the operational demonstration that Russia retains the conventional military capability and the willingness to use it to create real-time diplomatic and military leverage in theaters that are geographically distant from the Hormuz crisis, but strategically connected to it through the NATO alliance architecture that American military commitments in the Gulf depend on. If NATO assets are operationally engaged in the Baltic simultaneously with American assets managing the Gulf blockade, the total operational burden on the Western military system is higher than it would be with either challenge in isolation. The diplomatic track is the private pressure on Tehran to negotiate. Russia is telling Iran to make a deal, while simultaneously reminding Washington that the deal needs to be made within a strategic environment where Russia's interests are permanently present, regardless of what any bilateral American-Chinese summit produces. The three tracks together constitute a Russian strategic communication that is more sophisticated and more carefully calibrated than the Sarmat announcement alone would suggest to an observer who treats it as a weapons technology story rather than a strategic signaling operation. Now let's talk about what the Burevestnik and the Poseidon mean in this context. Because the Sarmat is not the only Russian strategic modernization program that is relevant to the current global situation, and the other two world-ending weapons that Putin unveiled in 2018 are at different stages of development that carry their own specific implications. The Burevestnik's nuclear-powered cruise missile concept, if it achieves the operational status that Russia has claimed for it, would represent a weapon that approaches targets via flight profiles that existing air defense systems are not architected to address. A cruise missile that can fly 14,000 miles or more at low altitude, hugging terrain to avoid radar detection, while carrying a nuclear warhead, and that cannot be shot down before fuel exhaustion ends its flight because nuclear propulsion provides indefinite fuel, is a weapon that collapses the distinction between intercontinental range and cruise missile altitude profile that Western air defense systems have been built around. America's GBMD system is designed for the high-altitude, high-speed trajectory of ballistic missiles. The Standard Missile family and the Patriot systems are designed for the mid-course and terminal phase intercept of shorter-range ballistic threats. A nuclear-powered cruise missile flying at low altitude at intercontinental range falls outside the operational envelope of both these system families in different ways. The Burevestnik's development challenges, evidenced by the Nyanoxa incident of 2019, demonstrate that building a nuclear-powered aircraft that can sustain flight reliably and safely is genuinely difficult engineering. But difficult does not mean impossible, and Russia's continued investment in the program despite the accidents confirms that the strategic value of a successful Burevestnik system is considered sufficient to justify the development costs and risks. The Poseidon's undersea approach vector similarly addresses a different gap in the Western defensive architecture than the Sarmat addresses. Ballistic missile defense is oriented toward the air domain. Anti-submarine warfare is oriented toward finding and neutralizing submarines before they can launch weapons. The Poseidon is neither a submarine nor a missile in the conventional sense. It is an autonomous undersea vehicle that approaches targets via the ocean floor at depths that current sonar and undersea surveillance architectures are not comprehensively optimized for, carrying a weapon that does not need to surface or launch a missile to deliver its effect. Whether the claimed tsunami effect is physically achievable at the scales Russia describes is a question that Western analysts have raised serious doubts about. But a large nuclear detonation in shallow coastal water near a major port city produces catastrophic effects regardless of whether it generates a Russian-claimed mega-tsunami. The weapon's strategic purpose, the creation of a category of threat that no existing Western defensive system can address through the standard intercept before detonation approach, is achieved by the weapon's existence regardless of whether the most extreme claimed effects materialize in the manner described. Now let's talk about what the current war in Ukraine means for the Russian strategic posture that the Sarmat announcement represents, because the Ukraine conflict is the operational context within which Russia's nuclear signaling has been occurring for over 4 years. And the lessons that context has produced are directly relevant to assessing what the Sarmat announcement means and what it does not mean. Ukraine's military has conducted drone strikes on Russian territory, including documented strikes on airfields and logistics infrastructure well inside Russian borders. These strikes have produced a Russian response that has included nuclear rhetoric, repeated references to Russia's nuclear doctrine, and multiple statements from senior Russian officials about the conditions under which Russia might consider nuclear weapon use. None of those references to nuclear doctrine have produced actual nuclear weapon use. That outcome? Repeated nuclear threats without nuclear action across 4 years of a conflict in which Russia has experienced significant military reverses, has produced an international assessment environment where Russian nuclear threats are treated with less automatic credibility than they would have commanded before Ukraine demonstrated that Russia can be pushed considerably further than pre-war analysis suggested without crossing the threshold to nuclear use. The Sarmat announcement should be read against that credibility backdrop. Russia's strategic nuclear arsenal has always been real and has always represented genuine deterrence. The strategic weapons modernization program that the Sarmat is part of represents genuine capability development that Western defense planners take seriously in their long-term planning. But the gap between Russia's willingness to make nuclear threats and its willingness to actually use nuclear weapons has been demonstrated empirically in Ukraine. And that empirical demonstration matters for calibrating how much strategic weight the Sarmat announcement carries in the specific context of the Hormuz crisis management process. The Baltic Sea deployment carries more immediate escalation risk than the Sarmat announcement precisely because conventional military assets in physical contact with NATO assets in a confined maritime environment create the conditions for miscalculation and inadvertent escalation that strategic nuclear posturing does not. The specific geography of the Baltic, a semi-enclosed sea bordered by NATO members on virtually all sides following Finland and Sweden's accession to the alliance, means that Russian surface combatants operating in the Baltic are operating within a geographic environment where every maneuver occurs in close proximity to Allied territory, Allied underwater infrastructure, and NATO naval assets that are legally entitled to operate in the same international waters. The Severomorsk's anchoring position near Fehmarn and Lübeck Bay places it near undersea cable infrastructure that connects Nordic and Baltic NATO members to the broader Western communications architecture. NATO's rapid response with standing Naval Force One assets confirms that the alliance has assessed the positioning as sufficiently concerning to require immediate physical presence rather than a diplomatic note. A Russian destroyer and German and French frigates in close physical proximity in a tight maritime environment is the specific configuration of conventional military hardware in close contact that produces the accidental escalation scenarios that strategic nuclear deterrence was designed to prevent but cannot prevent through deterrence alone when the physical proximity is already established. Here's the honest assessment of what the Sarmat announcement, the Baltic deployment, and the Burevestnik and Poseidon programs combined tell you about Russian strategic intentions in the current global environment. And it requires drawing a clear line between what the evidence supports and what requires inference beyond the available facts. Russia is conducting a deliberate, coordinated, and carefully timed strategic signaling campaign that is designed to achieve specific effects across multiple audiences simultaneously. The Sarmat test announcement tells Washington, Beijing, and NATO that Russia's strategic nuclear posture is being upgraded on a 2026 deadline. The Baltic deployment tells NATO that Russia retains the conventional military willingness to create physical pressure points in European waters, regardless of the Ukrainian theater's operational demands on Russian naval resources. The private diplomatic pressure on Tehran to negotiate tells the Islamic Republic that Russia's strategic backing does not extend to defending a regime that has crossed the threshold of domestic violence that even Putin's government finds diplomatically untenable to be associated with. And the Burevestnik and Poseidon programs tell every Western defense planner that Russia's strategic modernization is not limited to a single system that can be addressed through a specific defensive upgrade, but is a multi-domain capability development program that addresses multiple gaps in Western defensive architecture simultaneously. None of this means Russia is planning to use nuclear weapons. None of it means the Sarmat will actually be deployed on the announced timeline, given the program's history of delays. None of it means the Baltic deployment is the prelude to conventional military action against NATO infrastructure rather than a coercive signaling move. What it means is that Russia has made a calculated decision to use this specific week, with the Trump Sea summit imminent, the Hormuz ceasefire on life support, and every major power's attention concentrated on the Persian Gulf crisis, to deploy the full spectrum of its strategic messaging toolkit in a manner calculated to ensure that every decision being made about Iran, about missile defense, about NATO's eastern posture, and about the boundaries of American military escalation occurs within a strategic environment where Russian capability has been freshly and publicly demonstrated. Now, let's bring this back to the specific question that the Sarmat announcement raises for the Hormuz conflict, because the two stories are running in parallel and are connected through the strategic architecture that makes Russian deterrence relevant to American decision-making on Iran, even when Russia is not a direct party to the Hormuz conflict. The CENTCOM options being reviewed in the National Security Council meetings that Trump has been holding twice weekly since the ceasefire began include options that extend well beyond the current blockade and Project Freedom architecture. The Dark Eagle hypersonic deployment request confirmed by Bloomberg represents a capability that compresses Iranian response time to 0 for specific target categories. The 82nd Airborne's regional positioning and the continued presence of 3 carrier strike groups represents a force posture that can execute a significantly expanded operational scope if authorized. And the options being reviewed for that expanded scope, whatever their specific content, are being reviewed in a strategic environment where Russia has just announced the successful test of a weapon it claims can penetrate all existing and future anti-missile defense systems and will be on combat duty before the end of the year. American national security decision-making does not ignore that environment when reviewing military options, even military options directed at a state that is not Russia. The Sarmat announcement is part of the calculation that every option reviewer in those National Security Council meetings is carrying in their head when they assess the escalation risks attached to each option on the table. Russia intended it to be. That is why it was announced this week. So here is where we are on May 13th, 2026. Russia has announced the successful test of the RS-28 Sarmat, the super heavy ICBM carrying 10 MIRV warheads with FOBS capability and claimed penetration capability against all existing and future missile defense systems, with a deployment deadline of before December 31st, 2026. The Burevestnik nuclear-powered cruise missile program continues, despite its development challenges and the 2019 accident that confirmed the program is real and the engineering is difficult. The Poseidon autonomous nuclear underwater vehicle program continues as the third of 3 world-ending strategic systems that together address different gaps in the Western defensive architecture that no single counter-system can address. A Russian destroyer is anchored in a sensitive Baltic maritime corridor near German undersea infrastructure, with NATO's Standing Naval Force 1 assets now present in physical proximity. Trump is about to sit across from Xi Jinping in Beijing in the first U.S. presidential visit to China in a decade, where Iran's nuclear file is the dominant agenda item that neither side can avoid. The Hormuz ceasefire is on life support. The IRGC sent commandos onto a Kuwaiti island last night during active peace negotiations. And somewhere in Moscow, Vladimir Putin calculated that this specific week was the correct moment to announce the successful test of the weapon he has been trying to deploy since 2022, chose the language of 4 times greater yield than any Western equivalent and penetrating all existing and future defensive systems, and authorized a destroyer to anchor in a position near northern Germany that required a NATO standing naval force response within the same news cycle. The Sarmat is a real weapon. The development challenges were real. The successful test is genuinely significant, and the week in which it was announced is the most important fact about it, because the weapon's capability alone does not explain why this was the week to tell the world about it. The world that Putin needed to tell was specifically the world that is about to make decisions in Beijing about Iran, and the message he needed to deliver was the one that only a successfully tested ICBM can carry. Whatever you decide in Beijing, you are deciding it in a world where this exists and will be deployed before the year ends. Drop your analysis in the comments. Does the Sarmat's announced deployment timeline change the options being reviewed for Iran? Or does the deterrence calculus that has separated nuclear posturing from conventional military decision-making across 4 years of the Ukraine conflict apply here as well? Subscribe and turn on notifications. The Beijing summit, the Hormuz ceasefire, the Sarmat deployment timeline, and the Baltic destroyer are all running on the same calendar. And before 2026 ends, at least one of those situations will have resolved in a direction that determines what all the others look like when they resolve after it.